Welcome to the Shar School Power Lunch. This week, it's a roundtable on U.S.-Middle East relations. In the last decade, the Middle East and North Africa have been a cauldron of fire and smoke. Wars and oppression, saber-rattling and assassinations, tragedy and humanitarian emergencies. And in its midst, great prosperity behind fortress walls. Despite an inconsistent American approach, a subtle retreat from the region is becoming clear. What is the future of U.S. relations? What are the geopolitical stakes? What opportunities lie ahead? The Power Lunch welcomes Ben Hubbard, Beirut-based Middle East correspondent for the New York Times and the author of MBS, The Rise to Power of Mohammed bin Salman. Vali Nasr, former senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan, the recently outgoing dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Robin Wright, contributing writer for The New Yorker and a fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Well, much like sand dunes in the Arabian desert, swirling geopolitical winds keep this region in motion. The more things change, the more things change. Happy New Year and welcome to the Power Lunch at this very unstable moment in U.S. history. I'm Justin Guest, Associate Professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government. Today, we will turn our attention away from Donald Trump's tumultuous exit from office to discuss the foreign policy landscape that he will leave behind in the Middle East. Let me welcome Ben Hubbard from the New York Times, Vali Nasr from Johns Hopkins University, and Robin Wright from the New Yorker. Thank you so much for joining us. What a fantastic panel we have. Robin, we are now finishing 2 decades of foreign policy misadventures in the Middle East. Your reporting almost doubles as a record of these years. After all the spilled blood and lost treasure, what continues to bring the United States back for more? What is the nature of national interests for the United States that remain in this region?
Well, they're the ones that have been longstanding, and that is energy supplies, our alliance with Israel, our concern about freedom of navigation around the Persian Gulf, not just for ourselves, but for all of our allies dependent on the oil supplies in the Gulf. So we keep trying to pivot to Asia, but the Middle East keeps sucking us back in because of its wars and uncertainty. And because of our own kind of economic needs. So this is not going to change anytime soon, but I suspect the Biden administration will take a very different tact, and that is much more broadly to look at the issue of Iran's nuclear program and to look at the issues of kind of settling wars rather than providing arms to fuel them. I think there'll be a dramatic change in the approach to the Middle East. And probably far less focus on the Middle East, given the challenges, whether it's in Russia, China, and the other global hotspots.
Thanks, Robin. You know, in his recent book, Age of Iron, Shar School professor Colin Dweck writes that the Republican Party is likely to retain a nationalist approach to foreign policy in the near future. Now, on the other hand, Robin, you recently wrote in The New Yorker in a piece entitled The 7 Pillars of Biden's Foreign Policy. You make an argument that Biden is a globalist who will try to dispel fears that America is slipping off the global stage. What do you think are the largest enabling or limiting factors on Biden's ability to accomplish his goals in the Middle East?
Well, there's the broader problem of just American credibility and the fact that over the past 4 years, Biden comes back to office at a time that America is in a very different place than it was when he left the White House 4 years ago. And America's standing in the world, it has shifted. We're much diminished, not just because of recent events, but because of the gradual globalization of power, the rise of China, a host of other issues. So when it comes to the Middle East, we will have probably less ability to have a broad impact, particularly given the fact that China and Russia are playing a much greater role in the region as well.
Ben, in the normalization of the Saudi Emirati-Israeli relations, some see Donald Trump forcing Israel and some of these key Sunni Arab states to become less reliant on the United States in order to cooperate against threats like Iran, as Robin just mentioned, rather than fighting over old causes like Palestine. Do you think that we are in the process of an incremental American retreat from the Middle East, or is the United States poised to double down, knowingly or not?
Well, I think, you've had many administrations talk about how great it would be if we could undo our entanglements in the Middle East and pull back, and whether it's a pivot to Asia or focusing on other things. And it rarely works out this way. And that's either because disasters happen in the Middle East that pull people back in. I mean, I think for Obama, it was, the rise of the Islamic State, and that was something that, that administration felt that it couldn't ignore. And there seems to always be a reason or something that happens in this region that drags the U.S. administration back, regardless of who they are and regardless of how interested they are in actually being involved here. So, I mean, I think it's almost always premature to talk about a withdrawal. I do think that, I think that the Biden administration would like to sort of not spend as much time or as much bandwidth focused on the Middle East. I think as previous administrations had. I think, how things develop in the region will probably determine their ability to do that. And I think some of the things that we've seen are actors in the Middle East trying to prepare for the eventuality of that, or the possibility that that could happen. Israel obviously coming together with the UAE and sort of in a less official way with Saudi Arabia to figure out how can we work together on our sort of shared issue with Iran. How can we sort of work together for security in the region, even if we know that if we end up in a point where we can't count on the U.S. to help us out there. So I think that's kind of motivating some of the moves here. But I do think these states are going to continue to look to the United States for support and for security for things that they want to do in the region.
Interesting. Yeah. Vali, in 2013, you wrote in Foreign Policy magazine about your disappointment with U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. You conclude in this piece that, quote, America has not won this war on the battlefield, nor has the country ended it at the negotiation table. America is just washing its hands of this war, unquote. Many Middle East experts want the United States to sustain its engagement in the region, but it's now hard to convince many observers that the broader Middle East is actually better off thanks to U.S. involvement over the last 2 decades. It is also hard, I think, to convince people that the United States itself is better off from these engagements. How integral is U.S. involvement, do you think, to all sides' betterment going forward, and how would you convince these naysayers?
Well, I think going back to the point that Robin raised about credibility, I think the point right now for everybody in the region is that the United States does not have credibility in terms of what it wants to achieve or what it says it claims to want to achieve in the region. It is saddled with COVID, its economy is in shambles, its attention is turned to China, and also internally the country is divided. So the idea that the United States could really pay attention to the Middle East in a serious way is not believable by most actors, friends or enemies in the region. And there is also a serious debate in the U.S. that you refer to that we have paid, not that we shouldn't pay attention to the Middle East, that we have paid too much attention to the Middle East. In fact, in some ways, the rise of China can be explained by 2 decades of America's indulgence of the Middle East. And that both on the Democratic and Republican side is now under question. The key issue is that how does the United States leave the Middle East? I mean, you could wash your hands like I wrote in 2013 and let everything fall apart, or you try to achieve some degree of order that actually allows you to leave without everything collapsing. I mean, part of the problem of why we needed to go back in order to deal with ISIS was the way in which the United States left Iraq. It took its troops out completely. It decided to wash its hands of the country. And things fell apart. So I think that's the challenge that the U.S. has to think about. It's not about being fully engaged like we're in the Bush era, but rather we cannot also leave completely. We have to really think about what is the minimum order that we can help bring about in the region, and that would allow us to lift our hands from the Middle East.
Vali, if you were still advising the State Department on the matter of credibility in particular, because I think this question of credibility is a theme that has run through each of your responses today, each of your three responses, how would you advise the U.S. the steps that it could take to actually reestablish that credibility?
I think fundamental issue credibility here is that there has to be some kind of a relationship between America's capacity to achieve things and America's goals. Maximal goals like we're going to defang Iran completely, expel it from Iraq and Syria, take away its missiles. And meanwhile, we don't have the economic, the military, the diplomatic capacity to do that is not believable to anybody. The second problem of credibility we have is that most actors in the region's friends and foes are not convinced that the Biden administration will be there long enough, or let's say this legacy will be there long enough for them to bite into an American policy. What if in 4 years' time, Donald Trump is back or another populist president is back? If they sign on to deals with the United States, would the next American president tear it up? So I think these are the two things that are most fundamental to American credibility at this point in time is capacity and convincing people that American policy will have legs and will be sustained going forward.
Ben, your orientation is predominantly, I know, towards the Arabian Peninsula. In terms of credibility there, what do you think our partners and allies are looking for in terms of credibility there?
Well, I mean, I think certainly they're very interested in the way that the Biden administration is going to move forward with Iran. There was definitely a sense of, I don't think it's too strong to say betrayal with the way that the Obama administration pursued the JCPOA. They basically started negotiations, secret negotiations that they didn't inform their Gulf partners about. When they did find out about it, people were quite annoyed, and they felt that, okay, we've had this, decades-long security relationship with you and diplomatic relationship with you, and then without consulting us, you go and you start negotiating with our regional nemesis. And so there was a lot of anger over that, and so I think people are going to be watching how, I think that there's a certain sense that the Biden administration is kind of going to be an Obama administration sort of redux, but I think people are going to be very curious to see how differently they approach that. Will there be more effort to bring on some of the regional partners? Will there be, will they get to other areas besides just the nuclear program and talk about the ballistic missile program and Iran's other activities throughout the region? I think it's going to be the extent to which the administration engages with those issues that's really going to get buy-in from the regional partners.
More multilaterally. Yeah. Robin, in your reporting, in terms of credibility, what are you hearing in terms of the desire for U.S. credibility, and what steps do you think the U.S. could take?
Well, this is one of the challenges, and the basic one is America still going to be credible on its values? So I would add to what Vali said, and the fact is that there are, whether it's allies or enemies, they look at the United States and ask, does it really represent what it has always been about? And those are basic issues of human rights and democracy. Obama kind of got, in the terms of the Middle East, got into that during the Arab Spring, telling dictators they had to step aside, saying that for the first time, that democracy and human rights and participation in a political system were more important than our own kind of selfish economic needs and the desire for stability, even if the autocrats were in power. And that's really come to a crisis point in the aftermath of the close relationship that Donald Trump had with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and the arms flow that went into the region to fuel some of the conflicts, notably Saudi Arabia's war with Yemen. And so there are kind of core questions about what does America represent anymore. And I think Biden, can't just talk about human rights as Obama did. He actually has to be seen to implement policies that reflect our values. And the problem is the issues have been so corroded over the last 4, 8, 10, dating back to the beginning of the Iraq War, that it's going to take time to rebuild our credibility. It's not something that happens with the inauguration of a new president. And so the challenge is throughout the first or perhaps only term of Joe Biden, he has an enormous amount of responsibility in giving America back the heft and making it the model that it once was, because today we are not a model, as we demonstrated this week, when it comes to democracy. or stability.
Robin, in your most recent New Yorker piece, you write, quote, as one of his first acts of foreign policy, Joe Biden wants to renew diplomacy with the Islamic Republic of Iran and re-enter the nuclear accord that President Donald Trump abandoned in 2018. You note that Biden has a sliver of time to do so because of the Iranian New Year, Nowruz, is approaching, and then after that, Iranian elections shortly thereafter, which are going to pivot, of course, on U.S. relations to some extent. And of course, Hassan Rouhani cannot run again because he's term limited. What is going on in the background of these negotiations right now, and how has the process been complicated by Donald Trump's provocations?
Well, first of all, there are three different issues. One is kind of the process of what happens next. The second is what happens in terms of substance of the nuclear deal. And the third basket of issues is what about the four other problems or flashpoints the United States has with Iran? Meddling in the region, support for proxies and extremist movements, human rights abuses, and of course the missile program that Ben referenced. And so the process itself is complicated because the goal is compliance by the United States, re-entering the nuclear deal. For Iran's compliance, after it's engaged in a number of breaches of its obligations under the nuclear deal as a response to what Donald Trump has done. And the questions become, how does that happen? What is compliance? It's not even clear what compliance is. It's the same problem we had with North Korea. What is denuclearization? They never got to a common understanding. So then who goes first? Do the Iranians first roll back their breaches, or does the United States lift sanctions? So you have the whole question of process. And then the issue becomes substance. And there's been a lot of talk in the background over the last 6 months over whether the United States should go for what is called a JCPOA plus. In other words, something that is that takes the current deal and adds modifications, whether it's on the timelines of when Iran is allowed to do certain things when it comes to its nuclear program, and whether we add other issues. So that's much more complicated. And then the question is, does the Biden administration use the sanctions imposed by Donald Trump to press Iran on particularly its missile program, try to get concessions? And then, of course, what's happened in the meantime, amid all the tensions, whether it's the U.S. imposing sanctions or Iran engaging in breaches, is there's been this military tension that's played out in shooting, down drones, and then the U.S. assassination of the top commander of one of the Revolutionary Guards units, and as of today, literally the fourth time the U.S. has deployed B-52s, our mightiest bombers, around Iran to kind of signal, hey, don't try anything. There have been a lot of people who worried deeply about would Trump try to take out some of the Iranian nuclear facilities or do something militarily in his final days. I think that's much less likely given the tensions in the White House, the pushback by his own top aides, the resignations of some of the officials of the National Security Council. But, there's still 12 days.
Vali, you have advised the State Department in multiple capacities on Iran and Afghanistan. If you were consulted about how to restart nuclear treaty talks with the Iranians, what would be the actions that you would advise the incoming Biden administration to take right now in the initial weeks in office?
Well, Robin laid out the set of issues that faces the administration and is now currently being debated in Washington and has been debated for the past number of months very, very, very well. I think the key issue for the Biden administration is it cannot look at Iran or the Middle East in isolation. It has to look at essentially in the context of overall American foreign policy objectives. As I said, the United States is facing a lot of internal issues, still dealing with COVID. It has a problem of China. And in reality, if it's going to want to be able to attend to those sets of issues, it has to lower the temperature in the Middle East. And lowering the temperature in the Middle East means backing away from a near war situation with Iran that President Trump has created. And that essentially means that the two sides have to go to the deal that they have already signed. and in 2015, and tried to find a way to go back to when President Trump took office, which is Iran was then in full compliance with JCPOA as it was signed in 2013, and the United States was at least partially in compliance with the economic benefits that it was going to give Iran. Robin is right. The kabuki dance of who goes first and how do we get there itself requires negotiations. But as the Biden team has said, that is the floor. In other words, you cannot think about a new nuclear deal, let alone other deals, unless you actually reestablish the deal that you have. Now, going back to JCPOA may not satisfy everybody and in Washington, in the US, or satisfy Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, but it will lower the temperature for the United States sufficiently that it does not have to worry about another major war in the Middle East. Because we're at the point with Iran that either we find a way to reduce tensions or we got to go to war. And war with Iran is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar, headache that will make Iraq look like child's play. So going back to JCPOA in some ways a no-brainer. I think that's job number one. And then, you can begin negotiating an advanced JCPOA. I think the other sets of issues, namely Iran's regional policies and missiles, is a question of arms control with its neighbors. We cannot be selling F-35s to UAE and later on perhaps Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and then turn around and tell Iran, you need to give up your missiles. Or in other words, rather than have a policy of encouraging an arms race in the Middle East, we should have a policy of arms control in the Middle East, which sit the Saudis, Iranians, UAE down and say, can you guys agree to certain things that will reduce threat perception in the region? It's not going to be easy, but we're not going to get Iran give up its missiles unless it's part of an arms control deal. So I would foresee that the Biden administration will make a mad dash to restore JCPOA, because that's the lowest hanging fruit there is to get away from having to fly B-52 bombers and worry about an Iranian crazy action. And if Iran is enriching uranium at 20% plus, it's going to be on page 1 of New York Times. We want it to be on page 15, or at least I said Biden wants it to be on page 15. The only way to do that is to get Iran to stop doing those things that makes it a imminent headache. And then a nagging, headache, I think they can better deal with. But I think Robin is very correct in that even getting to that is not as straightforward as people might think. There's one thing that Trump has been extremely successful at is destroy trust altogether between both sides. And restoring that is very difficult.
Well, you can talk to Ben about what page it goes on the New York Times, but Vali, can you maybe turn the tables for us and take the Iranians' perspective? They must feel betrayed by the Americans over the nuclear deal, scornful over a number of recent assassinations by the U.S. and Israeli government, obviously concerned about the weapons ratcheting up. Where are they standing right now, and what is the nature of public opinion inside of Iran?
Well, I think public opinion is distrustful of the U.S., is angry at President Trump, but once the sanctions lifted and some degree of normalcy coming back, I fundamentally believe that if there is positive movement on the nuclear front, that the public in Iran will rally behind President Rouhani and the moderates, and in fact, their chances in the next presidential election would be increased. Doesn't mean they will win, but I think it would give them certain degree of momentum. Iranian leaders are much more skeptical. They if fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I mean, they don't want to go into another deal that 4 years from now will be torn apart by another administration. Or that they would basically go in and do certain things on the nuclear front, and then the United States may turn around and not lift sanctions or impose sanctions for other things on them. So I think they're open to restoring JCPOA, but they also want certain guarantees that they forgot to ask last time. But I think everybody down to the supreme leader have sent the right hints about restoration of JCPOA. Even the supreme leader said that lifting of sanctions is of utmost importance for Iran. Well, lifting of sanctions would only come if Iran goes back in full compliance. So I think that's where Iran stands. But on issues beyond JCPOA that Robin mentioned, I don't see any right now pathway there until and unless we get the JCPOA going again.
Okay, Ben, a source of some help to the Biden administration may be the reintegration of Qatar into the circle of Gulf Arab nations. Earlier this week, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and the Emirates agreed to remove sanctions that they applied to the Qataris, who have served previously as a go-between between the Arab and Persian worlds. What does this change, you think, for the Biden administration and for regional politics more broadly?
I mean, I think on one hand, I think that this, this kind of reconciliation, or what even you want to call it, is quite limited, and it's a long time coming and quite underwhelming. And looking back at, this is, started in 2017, it's hard to sort of tell what anybody got out of it. I mean, I don't think that any of the nations who imposed the boycott on Qatar would argue that they got any of the things that they were looking for. The Qataris, on the other hand, their economy, because they're tremendously wealthy, they were able to weather it, and they developed, more domestic industry and food production and things like that, things that will put them in a better place. But in terms of Biden, I mean, it will help the Biden administration to have, these Gulf Arab neighbors, all of which host various American military facilities, talking to each other once again and attending the same summits and things like that. It's probably a bit premature to see what difference that will make when it comes to Iran. I mean, for the JCPOA, they didn't rely on the Gulf Arabs anyway to go talk to the Iranians. They wouldn't talk to the Iranians themselves. And so, but I think once it does come to the point where they do want to roll this out in the region and bring along the regional Arab partners, this will be sort of one headache that they don't have to deal with anymore.
Can I just add one point to what Ben said? Is that although everything is always advertised as being about Iran, but there's also Turkey out there. And Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar have had different sets of relationship with Turkey. If you look at Libya, Iran is not the problem for UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. It's Turkey, and that's also part of this equation.
And that's another one of the underlying issues that caused, or at least contributed to this rift in the first place, that has not really been dealt with in any sort of way. I mean, I think that, so they reopened the airspace, they reopened the borders, they signed a document, and I assume that there were some sort of, backroom sort of unwritten agreements about tempering sort of the rhetoric on Al Jazeera about other Arab states and things like that. But since these things are kind of unofficial, they can be rolled back. And, this is not the first time that we've seen a rift between these states. The Turkey piece, as far as I know, hasn't been discussed at all, which Vali mentioned.
And Vali, do you anticipate that Turkey could prove to be a stumbling block that could lead to a new boycott, a new set of sanctions?
Well, I mean, generally, Turkey is a big player now in the Middle East. I mean, if you ask a lot of countries' security forces, including Israel's, they will say, well, we know exactly what the Iranians are and what they do. Turkey has now become the most, if you would, destabilizing force in the region. It got involved in the Caucasus. It's involved in Libya. It's involved in Syria. It's the only non-Arab country right now occupying Arab lands directly with troops in Syria. It's penetrating northern Lebanon. It's sort of Erdogan is pushing in directions that Turkey had not done historically. So it's a big new entrant into the region that sort of cuts across the Iran-Arab lines that we've been familiar with.
Ben, in November, you had written that Saudi leaders are expecting a less welcoming presidency from Joe Biden than the one that they received from Donald Trump, which I think is probably an understatement. But Saudi Arabia has been a major security partner of the United States in the region for decades, despite their resistance to U.S. diplomatic pressure in many cases. What posture do you expect from Biden toward the Saudis, given his regional diplomatic goals?
I mean, it would be impossible for it to be as warm as it was under Trump. I mean, what we saw under Trump was sort of this incredible and a truly remarkable relationship at the very top. I mean, between Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Mohammed bin Salman, talking privately, talking on WhatsApp, going back and forth. And I think that, for a long time, I don't think we will probably have any idea about some of the things that they talked about, because it was just so unilateral. I mean, you would talk to people in other branches of the U.S. government, and they would tell you, we don't know what they talk about. We know that they talk and that they sometimes visit each other, and we don't know what they talk about. So yeah, I think that what we'll see under Biden, I mean, it's a bit difficult to tell, but I think it's going to be much more of a kind of return to sort of the more institutional relationship. I mean, Biden has been much tougher, I think, in the campaign rhetoric. Clearly, I mean, he said at one point, I think in one of the earlier debates, that he planned to treat Saudi Arabia like the pariah that they are, which is a quite remarkable statement. More recently, he has. I mean, that was before he won the election, when he was still competing in the primary. So you can write that off as campaign rhetoric, or possibly write it off as campaign rhetoric. Now he said, that he plans to have a reassessment of the U.S. Saudi relationship. The Saudis, recently sentenced a very well-known Saudi women's rights activist that the U.S. a case that the U.S. and many other people had been interested in. Some of Biden's aides come out and criticize the verdict, and so there's been a bit of that. It'll just be interesting to see, once this administration is actually in place, which levers sort of on Saudi Arabia, or what leverage on Saudi Arabia they choose to use, and on what issues they choose to use it on. There's sort of a long history of, there are not very many good examples of U.S. leaders sort of pressing Saudi Arabia on human rights and getting concessions. And so it will be interesting to see how far the Biden administration pushes that. And then I think on the flip side, if they feel that that's the battle that they want to fight, when they might need Saudi Arabia to be, sort of more on their side, or keep relations warm because of things that they want to do with Iran, or things they want to do elsewhere in the region. Obviously the big question is, will there be kind of a more, formal normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel? There's, plenty of other places in the region that I think the U.S. would like to have Saudi on board for things that it would like to do. So, we'll just have to see how much kind of the talk about human rights and, translates into actual policy once the administration is in place.
Robin, you've also written about the nature of these relations. Over the summer, you wrote that the main fault line in the Middle East has shifted away from the Arab-Israeli conflict to tensions between Arabs and predominantly Persian Iran. But I think that what I'd like to ask you about is what this means for Palestinians in particular, though, as this has changed the nature of the relationship between the Arab regimes and the Palestinian cause.
It has indeed, but I want to give you a little bit of breaking news. Nancy Pelosi has just announced that she talked to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about limiting Trump's ability to engage in a military attack. She said the situation of this unhinged president could not be more dangerous, and we must do everything we can to protect the American people from this unbalanced assault on our country and our democracy.
Wow.
So it's very interesting that this is what we've seen play out domestically this week is now taking on a foreign policy dimension and dealing with the very things we're discussing today. In terms of the Palestinians, I've been covering the Middle East for so long that I covered the 1973 Middle East War. And throughout most of my career, the issue that has dominated the Middle East was the Palestinian question and creating a Palestinian state. And people, heads of state won Nobel Peace Prizes for getting, just slices of that process started. And today, the thing that's so striking about the Middle East is the Palestinians are the forgotten people. And the issue of a Palestinian state, despite the Abraham Accords, just have been pushed to the sidelines. And partly it's the Palestinians' fault for not having a more dynamic leadership, but a lot of it is because Trump chose to beef up the relationship between Israel and the conservative Gulf regimes. And that was how he defined peace. And so the definition of peace in the region has changed dramatically. And I don't know what Joe Biden, frankly, can do to jumpstart that process. We've gotten to the point that the focus is broader and, as Ben said, do you kind of take the next step in trying to nudge the Saudis? I'd actually be interested in hearing what Ben has to say about the transition that's playing out that mirrors ours in Saudi Arabia between the king, who is aged and ailing, and his ambitious and aggressive son, who has a very different vision, I think, in terms of what they want. And how does that play out in terms of the United States? I think if the King Salman was still the dominant player in Saudi Arabia, things might be a bit different than they are now that MBS is the main voice. The Saudi commitment to the Palestinians, or lack of commitment to the Palestinians, is really quite glaring, when for many decades the Saudis were the ones that defined what peace might be possible and made it possible for the Palestinians to survive economically.
Ben, do you want to indulge us?
Robin has pointed to, I think, what for those of us who've been watching the reason. I certainly have not been watching it as long as Robin, but this is definitely sort of one of these slow moving shifts. It's sort of like watching an aircraft carrier turn around. That at a certain point you sort of realize, wow, this issue is not what it used to be. People are not talking about it as much as they used to be. It's not driving regional politics. It's not driving regional wars. Even when the Israelis do things that the Arabs, in the past would have considered incredibly provocative, some people can, complain about it and whatever, but nobody's taking any kind of direct action of any form. And I think that the shift in the Gulf has been key. I mean, if you can look back at King Salman's history, I mean, King Salman, when he was younger, used to raise money inside of the royal family for the Palestinians because he cared so much about the cause. And they're just kind of not doing that anymore. I wouldn't claim that I have sort of deep insights into the discussions between King Salman and his son about where this goes, but I think that the change in tone that we've seen through the rise of MBS has been clear. This is not an issue that MBS really cares about. I mean, he's talked about it publicly. He's talked about it privately. He's basically said, we don't consider the Israelis an enemy. We don't consider them a security threat in the region. And he's actually, gone on the record and spoke about Israel as just kind of a country that could be another country in the region that, Arab states can have economic and security relationships with, which is remarkable for a Saudi leader. I mean, nobody previously would have dared to say anything like that. So where it goes, we'll have to see. I mean, I think a lot is moving under the table. I mean, there's really no reason to doubt the reports that, of this meeting between Netanyahu and MBS. I mean, there's really we know that all this is happening. It's just kind of a question of how quickly it's going to break into the open and when they might decide to formalize it. I've always sort of suspected, and I don't really have much to sort of base this on, but I do think that King Salman, because he was so involved in this for so long, has always served as kind of a break on a formal process. And so, if and when he passes away, we might see things move a bit more quickly. Or maybe not, or maybe the Saudis are happy to keep it where it is, where they can still get a lot of what they want from the relationship without having to deal with the, whatever popular blowback there happens to be inside the kingdom and in the region for having a more open relationship with Israel.
Can I just add one quick thing, and that is the one thing Biden could do, and it would be largely symbolic, is to say that we're to allow the Palestinians to reopen an embassy here. One of the most kind of abrasive things that the Trump did was to basically boot the Palestinians. The embassy is about a half mile from where I live, and there's a sign on it that says, for lease. And I think it would be something that would signal to the Palestinians that the Americans care, even if it didn't do anything substantively in promoting the peace process. But it would put Israel on notice, hey, we care.
So if I can just sort of maybe think of it a bit differently, I think as Ben said, the Palestinians no longer, the Palestinian issue, which for a very long time had a outsized strategic importance in the Middle East, has now sort of been downsized to being one of many issues, and in fact not the most important issue that is shaping the region. So the future of the Middle East is being written in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, in Arab-Iranian confrontation rather than Arab-Israeli confrontation. So in a way, we have a sort of an overhang of a policy that we've pursued in this country for 4 decades, but the logic of giving too much attention to the Palestinian issue is no longer there. So if the Arabs really don't care about this issue, and if it's not really decisive in the major strategic things that the United States cares about in the region, then why should the United States in some ways dedicate too much attention to it? And in an interesting way, actually, the Palestinian issue has now shifted because of what Netanyahu did from being an Arab issue to being a very dangerous domestic Israeli issue. In fact, a lot more attention is being now focused on the danger that the Netanyahu overreach has for the future of Israel. I mean, nobody's talking about the Palestinian issue being dangerous to the governments of Saudi Arabia or Iran Saudi Arabia or Syria or Iraq or UAE. We're now talking about the Palestinian issue being a danger to the Israeli government. And that's a very big sort of a shift. We have to really rethink the Palestinian issue, and it doesn't benefit the United States to just sort of carry based on the momentum of the past. There's been sort of 3 decades of investment in an issue based on the assumption that it mattered to the stability of the Middle East. It not only matters to the stability of Israel. And if the Israelis don't want help on this, if they don't think they need help, then I just don't see why the United States would end up getting in the middle of this. And I think the first thing that many Arab governments are going to tell them is that, if you're going to be spending any effort in this region, we'd much rather you spend it on Iran and Turkey and these conflicts that we really care about.
And you point to something very interesting as well, Vali, and that is that maybe no relationship of the United States will change more than the one between President Trump's and Netanyahu's. What do you think Biden's approach will be with Israel then?
Well, I would like to hear what Robin and Ben think. I think, managing Netanyahu would be very difficult for Biden. I think there will be some change in relationship, in the sense of the personal relationship will not be there. But I don't think Biden can necessarily change Netanyahu's policy on any host of things. He can try to contain the eagerness to sort of push for maximal positions on varieties of things. But if Netanyahu really decides that, let's say that Republicans are going to be back in 4 years, and he really doesn't need to listen to this administration, he can hunker when he needs to, and he can push back when he needs to, I think Biden will find that very difficult. And I think to one of the points that early on Robin raised, I think that Israelis are going to weigh in very early on the nuclear issue in order to sort of put their stake in the ground, get their positions established, and also to limit Biden team's maneuvering room. And then, if they succeed there, then basically I think that will be the trend that we're going to see for the next 4 years.
Robin, Ben, do you have any intelligence?
Well, I think we have to remember that Bibi faces an election, the 4th election in March. And this one may be a bit different in terms of the outcome. I mean, each time he's managed to edge his way back into power, but he also faces criminal charges. And Biden and Bibi go back decades. They've known each other very well. I don't think there's no personal chemistry between the two men. I think Biden, again, being the kind of old school, he's my generation. He remembers the Palestinian issue. I think he believes that the Palestinians should have a state. I don't know what he can do about it, but I think it's going to be arguably the most different relationship from the Trump administration, that and Saudi Arabia. Jake Sullivan has come out and tweeted about the women's human rights case. Some of his people who are not yet in position but have since been their appointments have been very articulate, very clear in terms of what the Biden approach will be. And I think this is going to be a time of tension, just as it was during the Obama administration between Washington and Jerusalem.
I want to pivot away now from diplomacy to outright conflict. Since President Trump took power, the United States has largely removed itself from its involvement in Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya. Robin, what lessons do you think the Biden administration foreign policy appointees actually take away from these struggles, many of which, by the way, they themselves were involved in earlier in their careers? What have we learned, do you think, from the recent past?
So we learned a lot more on how costly they can be, even if you think that they're going to be short-term, limited military operations. And have some decisions to make about whether he should go through on Trump.
Robin, I think we're having trouble with your audio. I'm sorry for interrupting. I think we're having trouble with your audio. You may need to close any other applications that may be open, and then we'll come back to you. Ben, I just want to bring you in because I think that this is also relevant to some of your reporting. In your recent obituary for Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa in Bahrain, Bahrain's now deceased prime minister, you referred to a quote that he gave when he said that this is not an Arab Spring. Spring is connected with flowers, happy people, and love, not death, chaos, and destruction. What do you think that the legacy of the Arab Spring is in the Middle East today? Because that was obviously a very different way of looking at the situation.
I mean, I would expect that what they come to the region with is almost a sense of humility about what America can actually achieve here. We've seen, whether it was sort of, if you want to go, yeah, it depends on how far back you want to go back. But we have sort of the invasion of Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein and bring democracy. Then we have, you can look at sort of Arabs. You can look at the war in Afghanistan, which Vali knows, much more about than I do. You can look at sort of the Arab Spring and all the various ways that the United States tried to sort of guide these popular movements towards bringing about more democracy, instilling better political systems and whatever. And then, all the way through sort of wars in Syria, wars in Iraq, ISIS, post-ISIS, supporting the Kurds in Syria. And there's kind of not much to show for any of it. I mean, I would argue, they're the place, the rare place in the region where, democracy does seem to have come along. In Tunisia is a place that the U.S. wasn't particularly engaged at all. It would be, and so I think that they would have to come to the region with a bit of sort of, humility about what American capabilities could do, just because I don't think there are a lot of great examples, whether it's just diplomacy, whether it's funding, whether it's actual military activity, that have really sort of brought about sort of, the means expended almost never sort of bring about the ends that the people who expend them hope that they're going to bring about.
Let's bring Robin back now. Robin, this is what you get for multitasking with Nancy Pelosi during our broadcast. What do you think was the takeaway from these past civil conflicts that the U.S. was engaged in?
Well, as I tried to say earlier, that I think the lesson is that what seems like a short-term military operation can drag on into some of your longest wars at great human and financial expense. One of the things that will be toughest for Biden is deciding whether to follow through on what Trump has ordered, and that is the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan by May. General McKenzie said this is going to be conditional on what happens on the ground, and the fact is that there is no real political process. I mean, there are discussions between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but they are still talking about process and not substance. And they have to get a lot further for the United States to feel that it can withdraw completely. Now, I don't foresee Joe Biden, given what Democratic administrations have done in the past, being willing to send more troops if the Afghans don't make more progress. But the danger is that there are challenges on the ground militarily, that the Taliban engages in a lot of mischief. Or in Iraq, that we're down also to 2,500 troops, that there are the pro-Iranian militias gain more traction on the ground, present more threats to the U.S. Embassy and U.S. military personnel. And then there's some really tough decisions to be made. And I think Biden will be very gun shy, given the divisions in our country, given the cost that would be involved, given the reluctance of the military to go deeper. But does that leave us in a kind of military purgatory where we're still there, but our enemies or the jihadi or extremist forces are actually making headway?
Yeah, and Vali, in your 2014 book, The Dispensable Nation, you presaged more uprisings in the Middle East, but against the United States, not just against each other. Now, this hasn't quite transpired, but where is Middle Eastern public opinion heading these days?
Well, partly it's because the United States has reduced its footprint in the region. I mean, if the U.S. It does not have large numbers of troops in Iraq or in Syria, it's not likely to be the focus of a lot of political activity. But I think actually generally the trend line is towards reduction of U.S. troops in the region. I think what Robin said about Afghanistan also holds true about Iraq, holds true about Syria. And also we have to remember that one of the things that's happened during the Trump administration is that American public opinion's focus on terrorism has diminished. I mean, half of the country has been seeing President Trump as the chief terrorist, if you would, and the greatest threat, existential threat to the American political system, as he displayed during the course of this week. The other half, which are his supporters now, view migrants and Mexicans and Guatemalans as being a greater threat to the United States than Arabs, Muslims, and what comes out of the Middle East. And with this sort of lifting of, if you would, the domestic public pressure on American leaders to continuously be vigilant in the region against terrorism, unless there is a major event, it's much more likely that the United States will try to find a way out of Syria, out of Iraq, and out of Afghanistan. Unfortunately for President Biden, the deal in Afghanistan or an endgame in Syria was not negotiated, finalized, and put in place during the Trump administration. So Trump started a process with the Taliban. The United States arrived at an agreement with the Taliban, but the Taliban have not arrived at an agreement with the Afghan government. And that puts the United States in a very difficult place. But the key question is, does the Biden administration decide to hold the number of troops where it is, sort of freeze things as they are on January 20th? Does it try to sort of put back more troops in the ground in Iraq and Syria, in Afghanistan? Or does it find a way to continue the trend that was started during the Trump administration? And my sense is that they will look for ways to try to bring some of these conflicts to an end, so that it allows the United States to focus its energies on other theaters of conflict, in particular on Asia and China.
Thanks, Vali. Let me just take this moment to remind our viewers that if you want to ask a question to our panelists, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll come to those closer to the top of the hour. Before we get there, as the United States has mulled this possible retreat and re-engagement in the Middle East, China and Russia have opportunistically sought to fill in the void in limited and geopolitically strategic ways. Ben has recently covered the way some Middle Eastern leaders have sought political and technological support that they cannot count on from the West any longer. Robin, you've been conducting new reporting on this, including, I believe, with an interview of General McKenzie. What is taking place right now, and what is the long game for these third-party countries?
Well, one of the things that I think that Central Command, which is headed by General McKenzie, is most concerned about is the kind of shifting weaponry. There's a lot of focus on the issue of drones and mercenaries. And this is where you find the kind of the militias in the region turning, and some of the governments turning to Russia, particularly for support of the Wagner group, as they call it, the mercenary force that is deployed both in Syria and Libya, and the drones. Libya is one of the biggest theaters of drone warfare in the world today. And so the Russians have gone in ways that, we used to be afraid of their nuclear weapons and the missiles and so forth. And a lot of the things that are happening now are smaller weaponry, but they are changing the nature of conflict and the threats we face. When it comes to China, it's a very different type of operation. They're engaging in the region economically, and they're trying increasingly to, whether it's build up relationships through building ports or giving loans that then makes a country indebted when it can't pay back the loans. And so there's some political leverage there. And so both Russia and China are gaming the Middle East much better than the United States is when it comes to long-term interests, because Russia is now a major player in North Africa. It has a port access and an Air Force base in Syria. It's on the Mediterranean. And China also is, whether it's, and Ben would know better than I do, but at one point there was talk of China coming in and providing loans to the poor Lebanese government. Who would have thought that China would have that presence on the Mediterranean too, right on the border with the West. And so I think that there are a lot of things that we're not paying a lot of attention to in terms of what the tactics, the weaponry, the political gaming that's going on, and how both countries are building more influence in the region.
Ben, do you want to describe some of your reporting? Because I know it's also pertains to other countries beyond just China as well, right?
I mean, I do think that as I said earlier on, I think the whole sort of any discussion about U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East is incredibly premature, and I think it's overblown. I mean, I think that there is an effort to pull back. I think there are places where we pulled back, and this is an opportunity for these other powers to come in. I think as the U.S. tries to sort of wash its hands of these places, they're going to try to come in. And we've seen it in various places. I mean, I think that when it comes to the region, I think the Russians have less to offer than the Chinese. They tend to intervene in effectively failed states, Syria, Libya. In Syria, they invested much more than the United States did. They were basically trying to save Bashar al-Assad, and they succeeded in doing so. But along the way, they basically destroyed the entire city of Aleppo, killed huge numbers of people, and now they basically have a pariah state on the Mediterranean that's their good friend, and they can't rebuild it because they don't have the money and nobody else wants to rebuild it.
Mm.
So I think that they do have less to offer. Libya, I think that they've invested less there, and they might actually get more out of it than they're getting out of Syria. I think Syria is a millstone around their neck. I don't know how they get sort of any, unless you're thinking in the very long term that someday Syria is going to rebuild. But I think now it's basically a failed state that the rest of the world has decided they're responsible for. The Chinese, Robin drew a very good distinction that the Chinese are basically interested in in the economy. They're looking for investment opportunities. As far as I know, they have not gone through with any of the investments in Lebanon, basically because it's a bad investment. That might go through in the future, but as far as I'm aware, they haven't actually put any money here because they don't think there's anything to get out of it. I think in the perspective from the region, I do think that a lot of the regional leaders are interested in, the talk that you hear specifically in the Gulf has been about diversifying alliances. They never say we're preparing for the US to dump us or we want to get away from the US, but it's this idea we want to have more diversified alliances. And I think part of the attraction of that, I think, there's almost, you can call it kind of an authoritarian affinity. If you take the example of sort of the murder of, Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, it caused a huge headache for the Saudis in Washington. It even became a headache for Donald Trump, even though he wanted to ignore it. Meanwhile, Putin doesn't really care. The Chinese don't really care. They didn't talk about, they didn't have sort of people in across their government condemning the Saudis and saying we need to do this and that. And so I think there is a sense that sort of these governments will leave us alone when it comes to how we run our countries domestically, but we can still work with them on security issues and on economic issues and stuff. But I also think that still we're at a point where there's I think certainly for the long-term US partners, if we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, there's really no substitute for the United States. And I think that they're going to be hesitant to go too far in, what they get from these other countries because they don't want to sort of damage the US relationship. So I think that we're going to see, certainly Russia and China getting involved in places where the US is not particularly active, Syria, Libya, other places like that. We'll have to kind of see what exactly they get out of it.
Can I just add something?
Can I just add quickly to, so two points that are also important to note. One is that for Russia and China, the Middle East is their neighborhood. They have Muslim populations that actually bleed immediately into the region. For the United States, the Middle East is somewhere far away, which we have to justify why we're there. And in fact, if there is any strategic reason left for the United States to stay in the Middle East, it has to be part of its great power rivalry with Russia and China. If you looked at Afghanistan today, the Chinese have a partnership with Pakistan. They're forging a partnership with Iran. Once the United States leave Afghanistan, that entire corridor from Central Asia to the Arabian Sea essentially will be dominated by China. And so the issue, if you looked at it the other way around, is that the Chinese and the Russians have long-term interests. One of the problems we have is that we always think about China as a Pacific country, as if it's about East Asia. The Chinese don't see it that way. The Chinese are also a West Asian country. They border on India, they border on Pakistan, they border on Central Asia. It's increasingly more important to them. So for them, it's a strategic game. And then on the issue that Ben raised, I think, not only China, but India, these countries that are now becoming much more important in terms of trade and economy in the Persian Gulf region in particular, their influence on the region will be different than the United States. Unlike the United States, they're not into picking teams who they're with, you're with us or against us. They want to do business on both sides of the Gulf. Their inclination is to force these countries to get along rather than try to find ways to sort of arm them to sort out their fighting. So in a way, I don't think actually the Chinese or the Indian influence on the Middle East would be negative. If anything, it will force Tehran, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh, once the United States out of the way, to figure out a way to basically work with both Delhi and China. And you can already see it. I mean, the Indians want to buy Iranian oil. They're also UAE's largest trading partner.
Can I just add something on this? It's really important. First of all, the Middle East countries have also learned how to game the tensions between particularly the United States and Russia. And when you look at what Turkey did in buying the S-400 missiles from, it trying to say to the United States, if you're not going to give us everything we want, then we'll turn to others. And that created a real important crisis for the Western alliance, for NATO, of which Turkey is the second largest military contributor. And the Saudis have done the same thing. And I think that as tensions probably increase with countries that are either strategically important or have a lot of financial assets like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that you may find them kind of trying to play us off one another more often than not. And on Ben's point about Syria, I think the long game, the Russians have made a incredibly, not fatal, but a terrible investment in Syria, because I think once the war ends, that Bashar Assad is actually in more trouble than he has been during the war. And when he has to rebuild his country, where there will be some kind of, memory of what happened 10 years ago this month when the Arab uprising began, and that we'll begin to see the real dangers of a failing state. But Syria also is a country that borders many of our allies, many countries in which we have an interest. And so we have to care about it. We can't just walk away and let it fail completely for fear of what the consequences would be, whether it's kind of the erosion of the kind of territorial boundaries and the breakup of the state, as we saw ISIS was so capable of doing. That there are a lot of things that in this big power game that plays out, one chapter of it in the Middle East, that there are a lot of things long-term that we have an interest in. One final note, and that is I think that Biden can be far more effective in using American resources in aid rather than trying to focus on arms sales and building up military security issues.
Before we shift over to our audience's questions, because there's several now, I want to just ask Ben one final question. We may actually see more appeals beyond the West, I wonder, in light of the catastrophic collapse in oil prices, which fell below zero over the last year. When producers ran out of storage facilities, of course, some were forced to actually pay buyers to take the oil that the firms had no place to keep. Ben, what are the long-run effects of these collapses, do you think, on the oil-producing states in the Middle East, and how do you think it'll affect their politics?
I think this is another one of the major sort of long-term and slow-going shifts in the Middle East, similar to the sort of normalization or change in thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that it's not going to happen, tomorrow or next year, but it's something that's going to really reshape the place. And so you have kind of happening in tandem, you have just the collapse, the severe decline of oil prices. So certainly the main commodity that most of the Gulf states certainly have built their economies on is just worth a lot less. Most of them also have had huge demographic explosions, so they have many more people that they need to take care of than they had before when oil was worth a lot more. And on the flip side, because of climate change, because of renewable energy becoming less expensive, it's doing two things. I think when you look at it, and it's creating a huge dilemma for the Gulf countries. On kind of the political side, they're going. I think they've already started to discover that the U.S. just needs them less than they used to. The U.S. Saudi relationship goes back to it goes back to the Second World War, and it was, not exclusively but largely based on United States trying to secure access to Saudi oil. And then you have sort of the Carter Doctrine, where the U.S. committed to ensuring the free flow of oil because it was so important to the American economy and to the world economy. And so, as that, the U.S. Becomes less reliant on Gulf oil, there's just going to be there's going to be less reason for the U.S. to get involved in politics in this region, and the whole kind of motivation for having those relationships is not as strong as it used to be. And domestically, it just poses huge challenge to the whole economic setup in these countries. They have economic models that are based on having huge amounts of effectively free money that they can use to support their populations and pay for all sorts of things. And now kind of the combination of having less income from oil and then also large demographic booms over the last number of decades. They just don't have the money to take care of these people anymore. I think that a lot of these states are aware of this. I think it's going to be very acute in places like Oman, Kuwait. Saudi Arabia will eventually get there. I think the UAE is doing a lot to invest in sustainable energy. The Saudis, it's a key part of Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030. But when you really look at the size of the challenge, the size of the economic recalibration that needs to happen for these countries to maintain anything close to the standard of living that they've known and supported by some other kind of economic activity outside of oil, it's almost impossible to imagine how they're going to do it. So as this thing rolls forward, it could unleash all sorts of, whether it's domestic political issues, whether it's, other kinds of political deals, or economic deals about what they do with the remaining oil. But it's definitely, I think, in the, medium to long term, just it has to reshape the way that these countries function.
Thanks so much, Ben. Let me just take this moment to remind our audience that this is our penultimate edition of the Power Lunch. Next week is the final edition of the Power Lunch, at least in the series for the winter, and it's going to be an extraordinary panel on U.S.-Asia relations. As you'll see on the screen, it's going to feature the former U.S. ambassador to China, Max Baucus, also former U.S. senator from Montana. Shabani Matani, who is the Washington Post correspondent and based in Hong Kong and covers Southeast Asia for the Post, and also H.R. McMaster, previously the National Security Advisor in Donald Trump's administration and author of a new book, Battlegrounds. Don't forget to watch that one next week, same time, 12 noon on Friday. It's going to be a fantastic panel, and of course, it'll round out the series, which is stretched from Election Day all the way to Inauguration Day. We're going to take a 30-second break to listen to a quick message from the SAR School. And when we come back, we'll hear your questions.
A world in motion. Our next generation of leaders needs new tools, sharper skills, leadership vision, and policy acumen to succeed in today's environment. A hands-on interdisciplinary education that offers a national and global perspective on the complexities of governance. The SAR School, a vision of excellence that melds theory with practice in the spirit of advancing the public good.
Welcome back to the Power Lunch. Let's take a look at our questions from the audience. The first one comes from Liv, who has a picture of her kitten. It is, in the future, what and who do you believe will be the biggest terrorism threat to the United States? Yeah, we haven't really discussed the threat of terrorism in the panel so far, so this is a welcome question. Robin, do you want to go here? You've written books on this, actually. What do you see in the near and long-term future?
Well, ISIS is clearly still a problem. There are still over 10,000 fighters just in Syria and Iraq. And of course, ISIS has proliferated across not just the Middle East, but deep into Africa. I was in Mozambique in 1975 for Mozambique's independence, and I'm just flabbergasted that ISIS actually has penetrated as far as the borders of South Africa on the Indian Ocean. And you look at Al-Qaeda too, it is still active, and particularly in North Africa, West Africa. And so there are real dangers down the road as states face economic problems, can't respond to the pandemic, that there is a frailty, a vulnerability in so many more countries today. In the aftermath of getting a vaccine and helping people come out into society again, I suspect we are likely to see protests in a lot of places that can be, or anti-government or movements or questioning of government effectiveness in a lot of countries, and that we could down the road face a lot of instability in countries that we care about, and in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, even in parts of Europe. So let's not forget that the jihadis are still out there. They have an agenda. They haven't been able to recruit. They still, on the dark web, are very active in propaganda. They are going to be a factor. The fact is the U.S. is still bombing irregularly and less than it did during the height of the Islamic State, but it is still deeply involved. And that presence in Iraq and northeast Syria is still important.
Ben, did you want to add anything there?
Well, Robin raises a very good point that I think, U.S. policymakers should remember, that we tend to think of terrorism as this thing that sort of exists on its own, that comes out of nowhere and scares people and kills people and does terrible things. But it's, if you want, because we're sort of in the midst of this pandemic, I think there's a very good virus analogy that, terrorism is really a virus that infects weak states. It infects places that have problems. There was a civil war raging in Syria for a number of years before the Islamic State showed up. And they would not be able to, it would have been very difficult for such an organization to get a foothold there had the society not already largely been destroyed. Iraq was obviously in terrible shape then, and you had, huge problems in the communities where ISIS was able to gather a foothold, and that's where the caliphate came from. So I think that, if we want to think about terrorism as a long-term problem, the U.S. needs to move away from this kind of cyclical interventionism of sort of, we ignore it, and then, oh my God, there's a new terrorist attack, and then we freak out and we send troops and we bomb here and we dispatch troops here, and then a few years later we sort of forget about it, and then we withdraw, and then something else pops up. It's really that the only way to sort of get out of this kind of cyclical nature is for these countries to be able to sort of inoculate themselves against being places where terrorist organizations can really take root, which is, obviously much more difficult than just going bombing some sort of terrorist hideouts and trying to kill people. But, as long as you have these failed states, these are the places where these organizations are going to continue to find footholds and take off.
Vali, did you want to add anything?
So I think I agree with everything that was said. I would just add that, after 9/11, there was a period where terrorism was sort of elevated to the single most important foreign policy concern of the United States, the issue that Americans were most afraid of. And it helped create a sort of an architecture, international architecture of security that didn't just involve the United States, but also many other countries, how they operated, what kinds of alliances there were. Now, if we are going to, the key question is that, yes, terrorism will be there, but will it be one among many other concerns of the United States? Or rather, will it go back to being the primary concern? If it's one among many other concerns, then I would think that it will no longer be as effective, and even the recruitment of jihadis, etc., had a lot to do with the way in which the United States sort of made the entire jihadi enterprise as the equivalent of an adversary to the world's greatest superpower. If terrorism is diminished, if you would, as an American concern, I think it will be there, but it will not be driving either our military policy or diplomatic policy, and would make for a very different engagement with this issue that we've seen in the past. We will have to go in when it gets out of hand, but I don't think there would be this kind of pressure on American leaders that they must immediately act lest their political fortunes be destroyed by a bomb that goes off at an unsuitable time during a campaign.
All right, let's take a look at the next question. This is from Saif, who asks, how do you see U.S. policy in the Red Sea, or more precisely at Bab al-Mandab Strait? Ben, I think this might fall to you. It's a very specific question. And Saif also asked another question. How do you see Yemen in the U.S. policy under the new U.S. administration? We haven't spoken much about Yemen. And I know this is also something that you've covered, Ben. Ben, I think your microphone is muted.
Yeah, I think, any policy specifically towards Bab al-Mandab is going to, will be sort of under the umbrella of the wider Yemen policy. I cannot claim to have sort of any insights into how the Biden administration is thinking about getting involved in Yemen. I do think that it's a decent time. I think that there has been a recognition. At the start of sort of the intervention by Saudi Arabia and its allies into Yemen, there was very much a maximalist approach to Yemen. I think the Saudis felt that, we have this massive military with all kinds of great kit that we bought from the United States. Why are, sort of these unsophisticated rebels known as the Houthis, who sort of wear flip-flops and carry Kalashnikovs, able to take over the capital city? And, they thought it was just going to be a matter of weeks that they could go in and bomb them back to their hideouts in northern Yemen. And obviously that hasn't happened. It's been this many years, and it's basically, it's fallen into a quagmire. And so I think that there is a recognition among Saudi Arabia and its allies who intervened in Yemen that there is not going to be a military solution to this. They're going to have to find another way out. that they're also not at the same time probably going to get the same pass that they did from the Trump administration on sort of mass casualty bombings, mass civilian casualty bombings, a number of which happened under the Trump administration, and to be fair, under the Obama administration. So, I mean, I think that if there is, if Biden administration can find time in its schedule, this might actually be a good time to engage and try to find a way to move forward on Yemen. It's not going to be easy. I mean, you basically have a rebel movement that is controlling the capital city, and why would they give it up? What are you going to offer them? If you can't bomb them out of the capital city, what are you going to offer them to get them to come to the table?
Can I intervene on that question? Because I think actually that this is one place we could see in an unexpected way some movement, and in part because of the Iran nuclear deal. This is an issue, Yemen is an issue that John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, and Javad Zarif, who's the Iranian foreign minister, talked about at length. And they thought at one point they had an agreement, and of course, fast sequence of events, it kind of fell apart. But this is something that the Saudis, the UAE is kind of pulled out of this war largely. The Saudis would like an end because it's becoming their Vietnam. The Iranians think this is a one place that they could deal with that issue of Middle East meddling. In other words, they can show that they're interested in ending the war. So I think this is a place that, ironically, it's on the back burner, or has been on the back burner of American interests in the Middle East for a long time. Could be a place that you see Iran and the United States move together to try to reduce tensions in the Gulf between Saudi Arabia and Iran and take that off the table. The UN would be the one to negotiate the terms, but there is, Zarif has put forward a 4-point plan, which basically mirrors what the UN would like to see happen in terms of sequence, and that it could be a place to say, you see, we can make progress on some of these other flashpoints.
All right, let's take a look at the next question. This is from Summer, who asks, isn't it time for the U.S. to address with Iran the root cause of their conflict? This is going to be leading, though. Toppling the Mossadegh government and installing the Shah might open the door to more positive relationship between both countries. Vali, this is a large talk about delivering in credibility. This is an ambitious goal.
Well, first of all, I don't agree with the premise of the question. The U.S. tried to meddle in Iran at that point in time, but it didn't topple Mossadegh by itself, and it didn't install the Shah. There was a series of historical events that took place at that point in time. Yes, you can. Madeleine Albright already apologized for 1953. I don't think the U.S. can apologize again, or it can do multiple apologies. The issue for Iran, realistically, is not about what happened in 1953. It's the worry that the United States would not be supporting another regime change in Iran, that it actually accepts the Islamic Republic as a legitimate player in the Middle East. I mean, when you ask Iranian leaders, their gripe is that the Bush administration and then the Trump administration actually were after changing the regime in Iran. And they want some kind of a guarantee from the United States that that's not the case. And then also they believe that the United States does not recognize the Iranian revolution as legitimate and does not look at Iran as a legitimate country in the region with interests. In fact, the use of the word malign Iranian behavior sort of underlines this. Iran is like a cancer that doesn't belong to the body, and you have to excise it and throw it out. I think that is what really will change the relationship, not sort of having a mea culpa about 1953.
All right, let's take a look at the next question. This is from Megan. She asks, can you elaborate on Iran-Turkey relations, specifically in light of closer economic and strategic cooperation last year? Vali, do you want to take this question?
Well, on the economic front, there is a lot of trade and back and forth between Iran and Turkey. There's a border that has been open. Iran has been, when it can, selling energy, importing things from Turkey. Where it gets problematic is when Iran and Turkey disagree on regional issues. So we saw that in Syria, that they were in agreement both on on containing the Kurds, because they both have Kurdish minorities, but they were in disagreement over Assad. Iran supported Assad, Turkey was not supportive of Assad. And most recently, they found themselves at odds in the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. So they have good relations. They have embassies. They have a lot of talking. Their leaders meet, but they do trade. They do business together. But they are also competitive, and they do step on each other's toes in the Middle East, particularly as Turkey is becoming a much bigger force in the region than it was the case, let's say, even a decade ago.
Thanks so much, Vali. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and conclude this week's edition of the Power Lunch. Let me take this opportunity to thank our fantastic panelists for what was a remarkably wide-ranging discussion that reveals your range and your experience in this field. It's such a privilege to be with you all. Don't forget to join us next week, where we have such another extraordinary panel with former U.S. Ambassador to China and former U.S. Senator Max Baucus, Washington Post correspondent Shabani Matani, and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. It's going to be a fantastic panel. Then don't forget to join us next Friday at 12 noon for the final edition of the Power Lunch. Until then, thank you very much and have a very good weekend.
Thank you.